Imagine waking up every morning knowing there was a real chance you would not come home that night, not because of a war, not because of a wild animal, but because of a job. A job laying iron tracks across a country that did not even know your name. In 1865, thousands of men did exactly that, and hundreds of them never came home. This is the story nobody told you in school. The Civil War had just ended. More than 600,000 Americans were dead. The country was shattered, broke, and bleeding from wounds that would take generations to heal. But the men with money and power were not sitting around grieving. They were planning. And what they were planning was the most ambitious construction project the continent had ever seen. A railroad stretching from one ocean to the other. It sounds heroic. It was sold as heroic. But the truth underneath that heroic story is something far darker and far more brutal than any history textbook ever bothered to mention. Two companies got the contract. The Union Pacific would build westward from Nebraska. The Central Pacific would push eastward from California. The government handed them land grants worth millions and backed them with federal loans. The incentive was simple. The more track they laid, the more money they made. Speed was the only thing that mattered. And when speed is the only thing that matters, the people doing the actual work become completely disposable. They recruited Irish immigrants who had crossed the Atlantic with nothing but desperation in their pockets. They recruited Chinese workers by the thousands, men who were paid less than everyone else and given the most dangerous jobs on the entire line. They recruited freed slaves and broken war veterans who had nowhere else to go and no other options in front of them. These men were not treated as human beings building a national monument, they were treated as tools. And like tools, when they broke, they were simply replaced. Here is something nobody tells you about those gleaming iron rails. Each one weighed close to 700 pounds. There were no forklifts, there were no cranes, there were no machines of any kind. Every single rail was carried by human hands, 6 to 8 men per rail, dragged into position, dropped with a crash, and spiked to wooden ties while the next rail was already coming up behind it. 3 strokes per spike, 10 spikes per rail, 400 rails per mile, every single day. The iron was not even good iron most of the time. The companies were moving so fast and spending so recklessly that the quality of materials was almost never properly checked. Rails that should have been tested and certified were rushed straight from production to the frontier. They cracked in cold weather. They bent in extreme heat. They shifted at the joints when heavy locomotives rolled over them. And when a crack in a rail met a locomotive at full speed, the result was not a slow, grinding stop. It was instant, total chaos. A derailment at speed in 1865 meant tons of iron twisting violently off the track, passenger cars rolling and splintering like matchboxes, boilers rupturing, fires starting in the wreckage before anyone could even scream for help. Men were crushed inside cars that folded like paper. Some were thrown clear and landed broken in the brush beside the tracks. Some were never found at all. The engineers who drove these locomotives knew exactly what they were riding into every single shift. They knew the tracks ahead had not been properly inspected. They knew the rails could fail at any moment. They climbed into that cab anyway, because the alternative was starvation. If the tracks were deadly, the tunnels were something that should have been called what they actually were, mass graves waiting to be filled. The Central Pacific could not go around the Sierra Nevada mountains. Those granite walls rose thousands of feet and stretched for miles in every direction. The only option was to go straight through. And to go straight through solid granite with 1865 technology meant one thing: explosives. They started with black powder. Workers drilled holes into the rock face by hand, hour after hour of hammering a steel rod into solid granite, barely making progress, fingers bleeding, lungs full of rock dust. Then they packed the holes with powder, lit the fuses, and ran. Sometimes the fuse burned faster than expected. Sometimes a man did not run fast enough. Sometimes a charge failed to detonate, and a worker walked back in to check it, right at the moment it finally decided to go off. What was left of that man was not enough to bury properly. Then came nitroglycerin, and things got significantly worse. Nitroglycerin in its raw form in the 1860s was not the controlled, stabilized explosive that would come later. It was a liquid so sensitive that a hard bump could trigger it. A slight rise in temperature could trigger it. Setting it down too quickly could trigger it. Workers were carrying this substance in open containers through mountain terrain, up ladders, down ropes, across uneven ground, praying with every single step that they would make it to the rock face alive. The Chinese workers who were handed these jobs had no training. They had no protective equipment. They had no warning systems. They were simply told to go into the mountain and blow it open. Many of them did exactly that, and the mountain blew them back. One of the most terrifying assignments of the entire project was a stretch called Cape Horn, a sheer cliff face hundreds of feet above the American River Canyon. There was no path, there was no ledge. There was nothing but vertical rock dropping straight down to the river far below. To drill the blast holes needed to carve a path through this cliff, Chinese workers were lowered down the rock face in hand-woven reed baskets, suspended by ropes over a drop that would kill them instantly if anything went wrong. They drilled, they packed the charges, and then they screamed to be pulled up fast enough before the fuse burned out. Some of them made it, some of them did not. The locomotives of 1865 looked powerful and magnificent. They were also essentially rolling bombs. The steam boilers that powered these engines operated under enormous pressure that the safety technology of the time was completely unprepared to manage reliably. Boiler explosions were not a rare tragedy. They were a known, accepted, and regularly occurring reality of railroad operation in this era. Companies factored them into their planning the same way they factored in bad weather. It was not a question of if a boiler would explode. It was a question of when. When a locomotive boiler let go at full pressure, the explosion was catastrophic. The iron casing of the boiler shredded outward in every direction at tremendous velocity. The engineer and firemen standing directly beside it were killed instantly. Not by fire, not by the blast wave, but by iron fragments traveling faster than any bullet. Pieces of a ruptured boiler were found hundreds of yards away from explosion sites. Entire engines were destroyed in seconds. Beyond explosions, there was the quiet, grinding danger of the mountain grades. When a fully loaded freight train began descending a steep mountain pass, the hand-operated friction brakes of the 1865 era were frighteningly inadequate. Trains gathered speed faster than any brakeman could compensate for. Once a train on a long grade started running away, there was essentially nothing that could stop it. It would accelerate until it hit a curve it could not take, and then it would leave the tracks and take everyone aboard with it into whatever was waiting at the bottom. Workers who maintained these locomotives, crawling inside cold fireboxes with scrapers and brushes, working beneath running engines in open-air repair yards with no protective equipment, were scalded, burned, and crushed on a routine basis. They worked in clouds of coal smoke and steam that destroyed their lungs over years of exposure. The lucky ones survived long enough to be crippled. The unlucky ones did not survive their shift. The companies had construction schedules. The Sierra Nevada mountains had avalanches, and the mountains did not care about schedules at all. The winter of 1866 came down on the Central Pacific work camps with a ferocity that stunned even men who thought they had already seen the worst. Snowfall measured not in inches but in feet. 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet of snow burying everything in its path. Workers lived and worked in tunnels dug through the snow itself, an underground world of ice where the only light came from lanterns and the only sound was the muffled silence of an entire mountain pressing down from above. Then the avalanches came. Without any warning, without any sound, entire hillsides of snow simply released and came roaring down onto work camps below. Men who had been eating dinner one moment were buried alive the next, crushed under hundreds of tons of snow and ice that settled so tightly around them that they could not move, could not breathe, could not make a sound that anyone above ground would ever hear. Some of their bodies were not found until spring. They were discovered still holding their tools, perfectly preserved, frozen in the exact position they had been in when the mountain swallowed them. On the Union Pacific side, the punishment was completely different but equally merciless. The desert heat across Nevada and the Great Plains pushed temperatures past 110 degrees. Workers with no shade, no reliable water supply, and no rest breaks collapsed in the dirt and were told to get back up. Contaminated water sources caused men to fall violently ill in the middle of their shifts. Flash floods that appeared from nowhere washed out sections of track that had taken weeks to build, and sometimes washed out the workers building them. There was one company doctor for thousands of men spread across hundreds of miles of frontier. His job was not to heal the sick. His job was to decide who was healthy enough to keep working. Every night after a 12-hour shift, swinging hammers in the desert heat or the mountain cold, the workers retreated to the camps that followed the railroad like a dark shadow. These places were called Hell on Wheels, and whoever gave them that name was not being dramatic. Saloons, gambling dens, and crime packed into rows of canvas tents on flat cars that moved down the line as the railroad advanced. There were no sheriffs, there were no courts, there were no laws. A man could be robbed, stabbed, and left in the dirt between tent rows, and nobody would ever answer for it. Violence was not the exception in these camps, it was the atmosphere. And beyond the camps, the railroad was cutting directly through the heart of territory that had belonged to native nations for thousands of years. The Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho. These nations watched the Iron Line advancing across their hunting grounds and understood exactly what it meant. Their resistance was fierce, coordinated, and entirely justified. Survey parties were attacked in open country with no warning. Supply wagons were raided and burned. Workers laying track in exposed terrain had no defensive capability whatsoever. They were simply men with hammers in the middle of an open landscape, completely vulnerable to attack from any direction. The U.S. Army was sent in to protect the railroad, and what followed was a brutal, relentless campaign of violence against indigenous people that the railroad companies actively encouraged. For the workers caught between corporate pressure, criminal violence in the camps, and armed conflict on the open frontier, danger was not something they feared. It was simply the air they breathed every day. The explosions were visible. The derailments were loud. The violence left bodies that people could see. But the deadliest killer on the entire railroad did not make any sound at all. Disease moved through the work camps like a ghost, slow, invisible, and completely unstoppable. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, scurvy. These were not distant medical terms to the men on the Frontier Railroad. They were the names of things that killed the man sleeping next to you and would come for you next if you were unlucky enough to drink from the wrong water source. Sanitation in the camps was essentially non-existent. Thousands of men living in close quarters, sharing water from rivers contaminated by everything upstream, eating food stored in conditions that would horrify any modern health inspector. When cholera hit a camp, it could kill dozens of men in days. When typhoid moved through a work crew, there was no treatment, no quarantine, and no way to stop it from spreading through an entire section of the line. Companies buried the dead along the route, sometimes with markers, more often without. Names were not always recorded. In many cases, a worker simply disappeared from the roster and no explanation was ever written down anywhere. Historians studying this era have estimated that the real death toll from disease alone may have been 2 to 3 times higher than any official record ever acknowledged. The railroad was completed in 1869 at Promontory Summit, Utah. 2 locomotives faced each other on the tracks. A golden spike was driven into the ground. Champagne was poured. Photographs were taken. Speeches were made about American greatness and manifest destiny and the triumph of human ingenuity. Not one word was spoken about the men who died building it. The railroad companies controlled the newspapers. They shaped the narrative from the very beginning, presenting the Transcontinental Railroad as a glorious national achievement built by brave pioneers. The violence, the explosions, the disease, the avalanches, the boiler explosions, the unmarked graves stretching for hundreds of miles. None of it fit the story they were selling, so none of it was told. The government had every reason to go along with the story. They had funded this railroad with public money and public land. Admitting that the project had been a human catastrophe for the men who built it was not politically convenient for anyone involved. The Chinese workers who drilled through the Sierra Nevada with their bare hands and their lives received no credit in the official ceremony. The Irish workers who laid track across the scorching Nevada desert were mentioned only as a workforce, never as individuals. The freed slaves and war veterans who gave their bodies to this project were simply erased from the record as completely as if they had never existed at all. Every time someone buys a train ticket today, every time a freight shipment crosses the country in a matter of days, that journey is built on top of something that most people will never think about. It is built on top of the lives of men who had no choice, no protection, no recognition, and no voice. Men who woke up before sunrise and pulled on worn-out boots and walked toward the iron tracks, and sometimes never walked back. Their names are not on monuments. Their faces are not in museums. History gave them nothing but an unmarked stretch of ground somewhere between Nebraska and California. The least we can do is remember that they existed. If this story moved you, if it made you see something you had never seen before, then hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel exists to tell exactly these kinds of stories, the ones that were buried, the ones that were hidden, the ones that powerful people decided the world did not need to know. Drop a comment below. Tell us, which part of this story shocked you the most? Was it the nitroglycerin, the avalanches, the fact that none of these men were ever acknowledged at the Golden Spike ceremony? And if you want to go deeper into the hidden, brutal history of the American frontier, the next video is already waiting for you. Click it now. You will not regret it.